Hello and welcome to session 3 of Brain First Parenting. If you have not yet watched sessions 1 and 2, I would highly encourage you to view those first so that the content in session 3 makes sense. In our final session, Eileen will be discussing the parent experience and how you can build resilience.
All right. Hi, everyone. Why don't we start with checking in from last week? I know the last 2 sessions, you got a lot of information on the actual parenting model, this Brain First neurobehavioral parenting model, on lagging skills that your child may or may not be struggling with, what this looks like behaviorally, linking that to accommodations. And then we talked a lot about accommodations last week. And then we also talked about when we're in the midst of a challenging moment, what's happening from a brain-based perspective for our child and for us. We'll talk a little bit more about that today, and why we need to find ways to teach those skills, repair whatever might need repairing, have those conversations, whatever it may be that your child, how they learn, how they can learn, doing that outside of the moment instead of inside the moment. I think that's about a good summary of what we learned. All right, well, we will go ahead and just jump in then to today's information. And as I've said before, feel free to just interrupt me because I won't be able to see you once I start sharing my slides. Because I, of course, want this to be more of a discussion than just me talking at you. Okay. All right. So let's get started with our last session of this program. Today, as I've said in the last 2 sessions, we are going to spend all of today talking about the parent experience. And there is a lot of reasons for this. One is that we can't ignore our experience in all of this and still make progress in parenting our child from this lens. It's just not possible. And the reason for that is that, as you all have learned over the course of the last 2 weeks, this model, shifting our lens, takes intentionality, it takes energy. I'm not asking you to work harder because you're already working so hard. It's just taking that energy that you're already using and putting it somewhere different. And making that shift just takes time. And in order to be able to parent our child over time from this lens, or really at all, even if you decided not to parent from this lens, there's an endurance that's required of us that we simply can't sustain unless we pay attention to our experience. Many of the parents that I work with, I would say actually all of them, when they come to me, they are wanting to understand their child in a different way. They want to understand how to help their child and how to reduce those challenging behaviors. And I understand that intimately, and that is a lot of the work that we do. But at a certain point, when they start to learn about the model, they start to really get they feel confident in their knowledge of the way their child's brain works and the model itself, just the information that we've gone over the last 2 sessions. Inevitably, they hit a wall. And that wall really is about coming to understand what it takes to use this model and stay in this lane or this framework consistently, and knowing that you have to manage what's going on with yourself in order to be able to do that. So as I've said for the last 2 sessions, it may feel like a steep learning curve, and this piece of it is no different, right? Many times we've gone years without thinking about ourselves in the way that I'm going to challenge you to do today. And also, you're capable of it, and it will lead to more hope, more resilience, right? Better outcomes for you and your family and your child. But it's that patient persistence, right? And so a lot of times part of my job is walking alongside parents and kind of holding that hope for them and reminding them of their goal and that it is worth it until they can start to see the fruits of their labor really, and see those outcomes improve. Okay. So that's sort of an introduction to what we're going to be talking about today. One of the things that I wanted to mention is last time there was a desire to talk about what about families? What about our family, our extended family, our friends, our neighbors when we're out in public? How do we manage those situations? What do we do about that? How do we help explain to those around us what is happening with our child from this brain-based perspective? I think today's information is critical to that conversation. So part of it is understanding how your child's brain works, of course, so that you can start to reframe those challenging behaviors from this lens for them. So, I know that it looks like he's doing this intentionally. I know this looks so willful. I get it. And also, this is what he struggles with. And this is why he's becoming so frustrated that we're seeing that behavior, right? Having those conversations, that's about deepening the understanding yourself so that you then feel like you have the language to use with others. But the other piece of it, and I think maybe, it's just as important for sure, is what about our own resilience? What about our ability to stay regulated and stay on firm grounding, grounded in our body when we are starting to feel like all eyes on us and we feel anger, grief, shame, whatever it might be, that judgment brings up for us? What do we do then? And it's going to be hard to have our thinking brain online and to be able to come up with that information that I've just articulated about helping them shift their lens if we get overwhelmed and dysregulated ourselves. Okay, so that's a piece of what we will be talking about today. So we've been talking about this behavioral lens versus the brain-based lens for the last 2 weeks. And so some of these sounds of the behavioral lens, you'll see they're acting like a baby, they're doing it to me, it's intentional, it's willful, it's manipulative, it's deliberate, right? They show no remorse, they're controlling, they're selfish, they have to have it their way, right? Really understandable interpretations of many of the challenging behaviors that we see day in and day out with our kids, right? Sounds of thinking from a brain-based or brain-first perspective is, what if they just don't get it? What if they forget easily, even this very routine task, and they need to be retaught? What if they are so overwhelmed or so shut down that they can't possibly have their thinking brain online right now, and so they are acting in this way? What if, right? So taking that step back, asking what if. Where we get into these sounds of behavioral lens is when these behaviors really bump up, clash with our deeply held beliefs and values. So when we're thinking about our experience as a parent and how do we get to a place where we can remain more regulated in the midst of a challenging situation or behavior, we first have to take a step back ourselves and figure out, well, why do I get so reactive anyways? Like, really, what is that about? So that we can then get a hold of our visceral reactions more and more as time goes on and stay more regulated in the moment, okay? So when our core values clash with our child's challenging behaviors, we have visceral reactions. It happens to all of us, and it will continue to happen to all of you because you are human, right? And so sometimes it gets the best of us in that way. And it doesn't mean that we're a bad parent. It's just another opportunity to say, all right, that wasn't my best self, or I reacted in a way that I wish I wouldn't have. What was that about? Remaining curious instead of beating ourselves up. So values, deeply held beliefs about what is good, right, and appropriate. So if we have a child who is behaving in ways that is not good, it's not right, and it's not appropriate, we're going to experience that clash. An individual's values are deeply ingrained. They are from society, religion, family, and other places. But the point is that they're deeply, deeply ingrained within us to the point where we didn't even know we cared about that until we had a child's behavior that clashed with it. It's like, I guess I do care about that more than I thought. beliefs, internal feelings that something is true, even if that belief may be unproven or seen as irrational. That's how deeply we hold on to our beliefs and our values. So we did not enter into parenthood as blank slates. It's really important for us to remember that, because when we have this visceral reaction to a behavior and we can tie it back to a deeply held belief or value and say, well, why do I believe that? Why do I believe that kids must act this way? It's like, oh, because I was told as a child that I must act this way. And my guess is that your parents told them they must act this way, right? It's intergenerational. And so it's a pretty heavy load to carry in that sense, right? It didn't just begin with us, but it's the experience for all of us. There are going to be different beliefs and values, but that intergenerational patterning of our deeply held beliefs and values, it's there for each one of us. Becoming more aware, bringing it to the forefront, remaining curious about it is really the key. So we talked about dysmaturity as one of the primary characteristics, that gap between the chronological and developmental age. This is oftentimes where we can see that clash with our deeply held beliefs and values come into play. It's why I encourage parents to get really familiar with what age does this remind you of, because it is always there to a certain extent. And also it has the greatest potential for clashing with us. So when a child is 6 and they are doing the things listed here on this slide under age 6, everything is going as it should be. There's no concerns, there's no anxiety, there's no anger, right? Age 18, most kids are working on most of these pieces, right? Or getting ready to work on most of these pieces. And again, as a parent, if that's happening, it's like, yep, things are as they should be. We don't even really think about it. But if you have a child who's 6 going on 3, or a child who's 18 going on 10, then all of a sudden, many of these expectations don't make sense for that child, right? And so again, if we have a child who's 18 going on 10, and we're like, but they should be doing this, they should be doing that, right? Even when we know, even when it's so obvious to us day in and day out that our child is really struggling with an illness or disability or difference that is very profound, we can still get into this trap because, again, we're human, right? And so taking that step back and saying, yeah, how would I respond to a 10-year-old who could not do this or who refused to do this? How would I respond? Some of those clashes with our deeply held beliefs and values come from what I call invisible elements of the environments that we spend time in or that we are in charge of. So this can be present in school systems, of course, but in our families, in our extended families, in church communities, in extracurricular activities, right? So I would just encourage you to think about some elements of some of the environments where you and your child spend time, and what sort of very rigid pieces of that environment clash with your child, and what you now know about their brain differences. So if there is this very rigid idea about control and power, where people on the top, which are usually the adults, have the power, what I say goes, don't ask questions, just do it, those sorts of things, and you have a child who is very cognitively rigid, who is not going to respond well to that. They would do better if they could. It doesn't mean we don't ask them to do what's being asked in that environment. How do we do that, though? Responding with no, that's the end of it, right? Doesn't work well for most of our kids. And so is that an element of your family structure, of the way that you were raised? And so you don't know any different than to raise your child that way. Doesn't mean it's that you are a bad parent or a bad person. It's just taking that information and saying, yeah, that is how my family ran. Me and my siblings were neurotypical, so it worked okay for us. But how is that working for the family that I have now that I'm raising, right? Social norms for appropriate behaviors. Knock it off. You're acting like a baby. Kids who are 12 don't act that way. You know better, right? Those sorts of things. Is that a common refrain in the environments where your child spends time? Timelines for development, timelines for tasks that happen every day. How is that working or not with your child? Expectations of them for certain ages, a teaching technique. Do we just talk and talk and talk to our child? I have to really watch that. I talk for a living. It is the way that I process information. It is the way my 13-year-old neurotypical son processes information. It is not working well. It does not work well for my 12-year-old. She's a 10-second child in a 1-second world, right? So understanding that that's not the way she processes. Grouping by age, lots of environments for kids group by age, and then personal history and personal culture. We talked a little bit at the end of last week about adjusting expectations. Just want to remind again, because it's so tied up in our deeply held beliefs and values, like, but at this age, they should be doing this, and I am not going to bend. I am not going to let them off the hook, right? That's very much a behavioral lens that is deeply rooted in our values and behaviors, what we think a child of this age should be doing at this age, right? Or what letting off the hook means. And how do we view that as a parent? Do we then think we're too permissive? Do we think we're a bad parent? And where does that come from, right? Does it come from how we were raised? It's pieces to be curious about. And remembering that adjusting expectations is an accommodation that has to be considered for our kids, right? And when they're going through an especially rough time, whether that is based on what's happening with them medically, whether that's based on, living through a pandemic and the added stress of that, whether it's them starting a new activity or starting school again, to always be remembering that these expectations that we've adjusted during those particularly challenging and overwhelming times, we may need to adjust again, right? That is about a cognitive load piece for them. It is not about giving in, and it's also about preserving our energy. We can only focus on so many things. So setting aside expectations that are not essential and focusing on the big fish, right? The ones that rise to the top. Remaining curious. You've heard me say this already a few times. If we can take a step back from behaviors and just get a few seconds even of space, instead of having that visceral reaction take over, and remain curious, then we have the opportunity to do something different, right? And doing something different may be us regaining our calm and our collectedness. We don't have to address that behavior if safety isn't involved in that exact moment. We will have the opportunity to do it later. It is up to us, right? If there's something about safety or destroying property going on, that's a different story. But many of these behaviors, we have the choice to say, I'm going to let it go in this moment so I can regain my calm and I can circle back and I can figure out, like, what was that about anyways, right? Thoughts are powerful. Developing a mantra or two, we'll talk about that a little bit later, so that you can stay grounded in the midst of chaos and distress. So mantras like, she would do better if she could, right? Lots of parents like to hang on to that. I think I've mentioned earlier that one of my mantras, which I got from a parent that I worked with, is stay soft. And to me, that's about staying soft in facial expression and body posture, because our kids are so observant, right? And so tuned into that, to stay soft in and stay soft in my words, right? So that is just the cue that I need to kind of chill out, take a step back and stay soft. There's lots of others that we can talk about. So deeply held beliefs and values, they are going to clash with our child's challenging behavior. Doing the work outside of the moment to figure out what is that clash about, and really trying to dig into that so that you can get space between your reaction and that behavior. The second piece of this is about understanding our own nervous system, what it does for us, and why we have to take great care of it, okay? So co-regulation is the key piece to understand. It's the interaction between our nervous system and our child's nervous system. So regulation. Regulation is about being in balance. It applies beyond parenting. You can see it happening in all different aspects of our world. But when we talk about regulation in parenting, we are talking about our autonomic nervous system. Our autonomic nervous system is largely an unconscious system. It regulates bodily functions such as heart rate and digestion, respiratory rate, and more. So again, think about when we are out of balance, when we are not regulated, what happens inside of our body. Oftentimes our heart rate goes up. We might have digestive issues. Our respiratory rate goes up, right? So that autonomic nervous system is what is at play there. It is also the primary mechanism in control of our fight or flight response. So one of the things that I want to make sure about that last piece is that you understand is that our bodies are really, really good at protecting us. And so when we are when we are faced with a challenging behavior, especially if it is aggressive or threatening in nature, our body is going to respond to that in the way that it needs to keep us safe. And so when I'm asking you to remain curious, to take a step back, to get space between that challenging behavior and your reaction, what I'm asking you to do, this is why it's so hard, I'm asking you to go against your own biology. I'm asking you to try to have your body respond in a way that is not automatic, okay? So when you hear about the brain's accelerator and a brake, that is another way to think about our regulation, and sometimes it's helpful for parents to think about in terms of getting this concept down. So stress is an accelerator. It impacts brain function. I've talked already about how our thinking brain goes offline when we are under a lot of stress. It's not the time to try to make good decisions or have conversations or stay level-headed, right? Same with our kids. So it's a human experience, not unique to them, not unique to us. So stress is not bad. It actually helps get us moving, gets us into action. It can be motivating, but too much stress, of course, has negative impacts. So typical brains, neurotypical brains, have a brake that balances out that accelerator. So we have stress, 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 stress. There's usually a brake that says, oh, you're going to be okay. Calm down, take deep breaths. None of that is conscious. Okay. Some of it is once we're able to kind of raise our awareness and have those coping skills to draw upon. But inside of our brain, inside of our nervous system, this is an automatic process. Dysregulated brains. So think about your child who may experience dysregulation over the tiniest, smallest things on a regular basis, many, many times a day. Stress has a more exaggerated accelerator response with an impaired ability to brake. Okay, so remember we talked about the window of tolerance. It's the same idea. If our child's window of tolerance is really, really narrow, which I would assume it is for every one of your children, then their thinking brain is going to be offline. That stress is going to throw them into that dysregulated state more easily than a neurotypical child. So those tiny amounts of stress provoke large responses. So again, it is not a willful, intentional thing. It is about the way their brain has developed and that accelerator and brake not quite working like it should. I want you to think about it in your own brain, though. A neurotypical brain, these accelerator and brake mismatches can still happen when you have experienced long periods of stress, when you've experienced trauma, which I would guess that many of you, if not all of you, have experienced in your parenting experience. Then your brain might work differently in this way, right? Where over time, small amounts of stress provoke large responses, whatever that might look like for you. Cortisol is released when the brain is trying to attempt to calm itself. Too much cortisol impedes the thinking brain. Brains that are impacted by toxic stress have much smaller window of tolerance for stress and an overactive accelerator under responsive brake. Okay, so that is our nervous system. That is how it works. Doesn't work well, works differently. All of it is an attempt to keep us safe. And when it's happening with our child, it's about their differences and their body trying to keep them safe. Okay. So co-regulation, how does our nervous system impact our child's nervous system and vice versa? I talk about co-regulation as being our greatest parenting tool. And the reason for that is that our regulation is contagious, and being understood, co-regulating, being understood is regulating. So co-regulation is when our nervous system gets out of balance, we get stuck in that fight or flight response. Again, it happens to our kids more easily, but it also happens to us. Our nervous system sends signals, they communicate with each other. They're doing that all the time, having this complex dialogue, sending messages about whether we are safe or not safe in a person's presence. And that is not a conscious thought. So this is not unique to your relationship with your child. It happens with you and coworkers, you and family members, you and your parenting partner, you and strangers. So say that you walk into some social event and there's somebody who's in the corner and you just kind of get this sort of agitated or uneasy or uncomfortable feeling about them. And it may be super, super subtle, but it's so subtle that you don't have any desire to kind of seek out their company or meet them. That is happening at a physiological level, right? Your nervous system connecting with theirs, buffering or triggering. So again, this is not a conscious thought. I think probably a decade ago, if people were to learn about this, they would think it was like woo-woo, new agey kind of thing. We have a lot of hard science to back all of this up, okay? So I think it's incredibly fascinating from a science standpoint and explains so much about what's happening between us and other humans, right? Co-regulation. We can be that buffering or triggering influence to those around us, depending on the state of our nervous system. So that is, I think I said this before, when I first was learning this, I was like, well, that's kind of a bummer. Because if this is an unconscious thing happening, it's not like I can dictate it. It's like the state of my nervous system is communicating whatever that is with the people around me. And it's going to be a buffer or triggering influence. What I want you to know is that the more you build your resilience, the more you start to work on your own nervous system health and stability, the more capacity you have to be a buffer to those around you, including your child, who's going to need lots and lots of co-regulation, right? Regulation does not always mean calm, but it does mean safe. And what I mean by that is, I think when people first start hearing about what it means to provide co-regulation and to be regulated, they think it's about talking softer, being really calm and serene, and not having anything be wrong, right? And that could be what it is. But when you have a child who, say, is dysregulated and their nervous system is in a state of shutting down, so it may look like they just flop on the floor and they just lay there, and you're asking them to get ready, you're asking them to put their shoes on, you're asking them to do whatever. It's not that heightened, agitated, out of control dysregulation that is so obvious and familiar to many of us. It's that kind of a shutting down dysregulation. Then what their nervous system needs from yours is more energy, right? So to kind of go there with them and be calm, that may not be what they need to get activated and to be able to have the co-regulation they require. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I just want you to know that regulation is safe, communicating safety, but not necessarily always calm in the way that we view it. So what does this mean for our kiddos? Our kids who have brain differences have a fragile nervous system. That's the way that I think about my daughter. Again, that is a mantra. This is her fragile nervous system talking to me. Oh my goodness, I'm seeing her fragile nervous system. Like, that is helpful for me in order to take that step back and get a space between that challenging behavior. What is needed most in those moments of dysregulation are compassionate boundaries with the co-regulation, which provides their nervous system with healing and with support. When it is consistently provided to them over time, self-regulation is developed. Self-regulation has to be, it has to be, let me put it this way. Self-regulation cannot be developed outside of attachment and connection, okay? So you have to have the attachment and the connection in order to help your child develop that self-regulation. So oftentimes when I'm talking about this with parents, they think, that's it? And I think, well, why don't you go try it? Go try it. We'll talk about it next week, because it is such an active process. So I really want to be able to articulate to you all of the ways that it involves us, our nervous system, us being resilient, us being stable. It has to happen because, again, our nervous systems are communicating whether we want them to or not. And how much better is it to be a buffer influence for our children and those around us, right? It's not going to happen all the time because we get triggered. We are humans. That's going to happen. It's part of the human experience. But if we can be more mindful of this process and focus on our regulation and resilience, then we can be more regulated more often to provide this co-regulation, that buffer, more often for our child. That self-regulation, we hear a lot about that in school and other places, and it's assumed that that is something that kids are, developed in the very younger years, and then they have, and that's just not true. So if you see kids who were neglected at birth, and so nobody came to them when they cried, when they had a diaper that needed to be changed, when they needed to be fed, their limbic system did not develop in the way that most people's did if they did have that loving attention as a child. And so they do not have the ability to self-regulate. It is a limbic system brain issue. It's not choice for them. This co-regulation can help them develop it over time. And that's a lot of the focus with kids who have come from a trauma history. What I want you to understand is that co-regulation, our need for co-regulation never ends. And so when I talk about you not coming into parenthood as a blank slate, perhaps you weren't neglected in the way that I just described as a child, but if you did have parents who were not attentive to you in the way that you needed from this co-regulation standpoint, then this may be more difficult for you. What I'm encouraging you and challenging you to do in terms of this co-regulation and staying regulated yourself may be more challenging. So I had parents who say, I understand what you're saying, and I want to be able to do that. Why is it so hard? Why can't I just feel like I can't do it very well. And like my partner can, like, why? It's like, well, let's talk about how this was for you when you were a child, right? So my 13-year-old, neurotypical 13-year-old, he still requires a lot of co-regulation from us, even though he's in that developmental stage of creating distance, right? So it never ends. If you didn't have parents who were attentive to you in that way throughout your childhood, that might be one of the reasons this is more difficult for you. So again, that is not to say, well, all hope is lost. That is certainly not the case, but to know, like, okay, I can give myself some grace and some self-compassion. There is a reason why this is so hard for me. And also now I know what I can focus on and kind of get help with or support with so that I can do this better, right? I can develop that self-regulation, those skills to be more regulated for my child who desperately needs that. So this is another way to look at it and visualize it. If you start up there in the left-hand corner with our child's fragile nervous system. So again, all of our kids, because of the brain-based differences, we can assume they have a fragile nervous system. What that means is they need larger doses of co-regulation from us. Because their nervous system is fragile, they're going to need more co-regulation than the average child, the neurotypical child. So then ideally, as a parent, we would provide our child with that co-regulation, but that is exhaustive, right? I mean, some of our kids need it, especially on days where they're struggling. It's almost like they need it nonstop. They are on that edge of dysregulation all day long, right? And so that amount of co-regulation is utterly exhausting. So in order to do that, we have to build resilience to restore our nervous system stability, to fill our tank up, to restore our nervous system health, so that we have the ability to maintain our regulation for longer periods of time and so that we can provide that co-regulation more often. Okay, so that is the cycle. Let me talk about this, and then I want to see if you have questions, because this is a big concept to understand and also a really important one. So how do you know if you're regulated? Oftentimes we know if we're really dysregulated, but maybe that in-between stage of how do I know if I'm regulated? If you are able to stay in the present, so not future tripping, not, oh my gosh, if my child's doing this now, what is it going to look like when they're this age or that age, right? Staying grounded. Are you anchored in the here and now, or do you tend to disassociate, right? Kind of leave your body, leave the current moment. Are you able to stay connected to yourself? So understanding what's happening in front of you with your child, but also at the same time having an awareness of what's happening in your body and with your thoughts. Okay, super difficult to do. Oftentimes takes a lot of practice if it's never been something that you've been asked to do or encouraged to do. And at the same time, as I said, staying connected to your child. So not mentally checking out, not losing it, staying present with them. And then tolerating the intensity of the moment. You know that you're regulated if you're able to tolerate the intensity of the moment, which means staying in your own window of tolerance, right? Not flipping your lid. Using those mantras, validating your feelings, while also staying anchored. So one of those mantras and kind of validating the feelings while also staying anchored is, this is as hard as I think it is. Yep, this is as hard as I think it is. Man, this is hard, right? So that is recognizing, validating your own feelings, but also staying anchored, right? Just one example. Okay. I want to bring you guys back as a group here for a moment. I want to see if you have any questions on these pieces of nervous system health, regulation, co-regulation, and how it intersects with our parenting. Is this a new concept to you? Have you heard it before? Do you have questions, misgivings, anything at all?
One thing I often say, and this is actually more about Eloise than about Leonel, I find myself sometimes parenting like my dad, which I did not really like. And then because I also see that she is so much like me, but like 10 years ahead of what I was doing. So I feel like I'm parenting a 15-year-old me sometimes when she's 5. And so all of that obviously brings up a lot of big feelings for me, because I swore I wasn't going to parent like that. Yet I did, but I also didn't know how to do so much differently. So would you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very agreeable. You'll see some of the confabulations and so that certainly comes up with the co-regulation, because there was little to no co-regulation with parenting me.
Yeah.
Alicia.
Yes, you have Alicia right there. That's right.
I appreciate you sharing that reflection so much, because it is the experience of most of the parents that I work with. Yep. And no shame and blame on our parents either. Like, they didn't know better either. They were parented that way as well. I mean, and a lot of this, at least with the science behind it, is pretty new, right? And so, yeah, Erin, I think your experience is really, really common. And as you said, it's a learning curve to figure out, well, what to do differently and how do I do that?
Mm-hmm. And it's also really challenging because his seizures really started to present or came back, or became an issue, I should say, when Eloise, who's now 5, was 4 days old. So I feel like I've been in an extended postpartum, like, should I still be experiencing these postpartum rage and whatnot of not being able
I'm
to.
7 years old.
And you are 7 years old now. Yes. So that brought up a lot of the not feeling like I was the co-regulation was not happening and hasn't happened consistently for a very long time. I will say I've cheated this last week and am pursuing my own mental health better and added a new medication and increased a medication. And it's amazing when you take care of yourself,
Yes.
how much you can tap into this a little bit better, because there were just some times that I could not. And, always thinking about the behaviors or something that they're doing versus
Yes.
what we're all doing. So,
Yes. Oh my gosh. I appreciate you sharing that so much, because there can be, of course, a lot of shame and stigma around taking medications, even just asking for help, professional or otherwise. Like, we are given the impression as women and as mothers that we should be able to do it all, even if we have a kid who has challenges, right? And so all of that societal layering too makes it incredibly difficult to do what we need to get help, to survive, right? And so this message of, like, so many of the parents that I work with they are surviving, right? And so my goal always is, like, how can we get you to a point where you don't feel like you're simply surviving and maybe actually thriving, right? It is possible, but we have to begin. Having a community around us to help support us is incredibly helpful, but ultimately we have to begin. So that's what I'll be encouraging you to do today, to follow Erin's example. How about others?
Will you be able to just provide us with some ideas of things that we can do to build our resiliency, to build up our nervous system? Because just this morning, I was thinking, how can you be present 100% of the time when I feel like, just kind of by default, having a kiddo with Dravet syndrome, sleep is fragmented, which is draining the nervous system. And, if you have seizures that become emergencies quickly, your nervous system is already being drained. And then you have these behaviors and your nervous system is already being drained. So when you're not getting sleep and you have lots of behaviors and lots of things going on, it can kind of feel impossible sometimes to figure out how, when you can't fix the sleep, you can't fix the seizures, what you can do for yourself to try to build up your nervous system and build up that resiliency.
Yep. Yeah, we will absolutely talk about those things. And what I'll say, I won't go into the details since we'll talk about it later, but oftentimes we have this idea of, well, self-care, we have a bad taste in our mouth for that in general, because of the kind of popular culture idea of what self-care means. Like, yeah, good luck with that, right? And that is not what we're talking about when we talk about resiliency and nervous system health. Those things can certainly help if you can do them, but they are not the only thing, and it doesn't have to be there. Those things don't have to be present in order for us to do that. It really can take moments a day. I think what's hardest for the parents I work with when we first start talking about this is believing that you really can start with moments a day and build from there, and it does make a difference. It's not wasted time and energy. So buying into that and just allowing yourself to believe that, and just beginning, right? Just starting. Even if it's imperfect. So, but yeah, all of the things that you've talked about, we're going to go into here in a minute, because you're right. Those things chip away at our resilience and are really hard on our nervous system. So we have to protect ourselves. Any other comments? The one thing that I would say about, if you are in a parenting partnership with a husband, male partner, we don't have any dads on today, but one of the things that comes up a lot with couples that I'm working with is each has their own deeply held beliefs and values and societal norms that make this difficult for them. I talked about the pressure on women. That's one of them. For men, oftentimes, they might have been raised in a household where the girls in their family were provided with co-regulation because it was seen as socially acceptable. It's the way that you interact with girls. You coddle them more, you give them more affection, you give them hugs for older ages, all of that kind of stuff. Whereas boys at very young ages, in some families, it's like, you need to stop your crying. There's nothing wrong with you. You need to act like a man, right? And what does that do when a child is experiencing distress and showing that, and they're met with, that's not okay. I will not provide you with co-regulation because that is not okay behavior for a boy, right? That's basically, from this nervous system standpoint, what's being communicated. And so men oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes didn't have the amount of co-regulation that maybe the girls did in their families. And so their ability to then provide it in their role as a dad is much more difficult, right? Again, doesn't mean they can't grow and get there. I've seen lots of dads be able to do that. It's amazing. But just to have that perspective too, right? For the men in our lives. All right. So I want to define resilience, because what we will do now is talk about resilience, which supports our nervous system health. And I'm going to go into the, not all the ways, but some of the common ways that I see resilience getting chipped away at, okay, in parents' lives, so that you can be more cognizant of how those things play out in your life, how present they are for you, and you can be on alert for them, right? And hopefully then move into action, right? And do something about them. So we'll define it. We'll move into those things, which can start to feel pretty heavy, because it's all of this like, oh my gosh, yes, me too. Oh my gosh, yeah. It's kind of hard stuff, right? It wouldn't be hard. If it was easy stuff, it wouldn't be chipping away at our resilience. I wouldn't be highlighting it for you. So just to know that, and then we will for sure end with, well, what do we do about it? Okay, so I'll pull you out of that despair and hopelessness if it feels that way to you, to what we can do about it. So resilience, to spring back, to recover, to rebound, to return to our original form. That is what we are talking about with our experience in our deepest parts of ourselves. So what resilience is not. It is not a fixed characteristic. So it is not something that we're either born with or not. It is something that can grow stronger over time with daily practice and attention. So that's the good news, right? It becomes stronger with lifelong practice. Each and every one of you is capable of building your resilience. It is not about grit or soldiering on. So it's about feeling as though we have choices in the moment versus reacting due to overwhelm, okay? So oftentimes, again, one of our societal pressures for many of us is like, I'm just going to get through this. I'm strong enough. So-and-so does it. I can do it too, right? That grit, that soldiering on mentality, that does not make you stronger. It chips away at your resilience. Resilience is about honoring our response. So it represents our ability to meet the demands of the moment, trusting that we have the internal and external resources to manage those challenges with the least negative impact possible on our physical, emotional, and spiritual selves. So that may be a leap for many of you right now to believe that, okay? As you become more resilient and your internal resources build, then you start to feel like, okay, maybe this is true for me too. Honoring our response is about acknowledging how difficult things are, but not getting stuck there. Okay, so man, this is really, really hard. Not trying to shove it away, pretend that it doesn't exist. Sometimes that feeling is that we'll get lost in it if we do that we won't ever be able to come back up for air. Resilience is being able to do both, right? Have a balance of both. It is about observing and reflecting, something we've been talking a lot about in our 3 sessions together. So recognizing when we are overwhelmed, honoring the response of that, being aware of our nervous system patterns of arousal, and so that we can maintain that regulated state. So many of us are aware when we are dysregulated, when we're kind of reached that end point, right? Because maybe we're tearful, maybe we have severe anxiety, we're depressed, or we're yelling, we've lost our cool, whatever it might be. This is more about being aware of when that starts to peak, when we start to feel the tiniest, subtlest signs of that, so that we can call on those skills, which we will talk about in a moment, and and maintain that regulated state. So here are a few pieces that I want to highlight for you, just to go down a little deeper in terms of what can chip away at our resilience, and what I want you to think about how this may or may not pertain to your life. My guess is most of it does. And how much you've been aware of it, how much you've been aware of it but ignoring it, how much of it have you not been aware of at all, but something resonates with you and you think, this might be something I need to think more about. So Brene Brown, if you're not familiar with her, she is a PhD in social work. She's a researcher. She writes amazing books. All her books are really amazing. Then she talks a lot about resilience, about connection, co-regulation, all of these topics that we're talking about today, grief and loss. She says the opposite of recognizing that we're feeling something is to deny emotions. When we disengage from tough emotions, they don't go away. Instead, they own us and they define us. It has this snowballing effect. She also says when we try to dim the darkness, we also dim the light, right? So if we try to really ignore the dark pieces that are happening to us, it diminishes our capacity to experience the joy and the light, right? She talks about depression and anxiety being the body's first reactions to stockpiles of hurt and shame. So oftentimes we are very familiar with depression and anxiety because that is talked about more often than anything in terms of mental illness, mental health in our society. And so if that is something that you've struggled with or are struggling with, I would just encourage you to think about that, right? That it's our body's first signs that there are stockpiles of hurt and shame that we might want to gently explore, right? Maybe with the support of somebody else. So our emotional experience, there's usually 3 ways that we deal with emotions. We either shut down, retreat, go inward. So maybe that's how you respond to tough emotions. Another one is what I call moving towards, and it's about people pleasing. It's about staying so busy, getting addicted to our busyness so that we don't ever have to rest and kind of stay quiet in our own head. If we're always doing for others and keeping ourselves so busy, we don't ever have time to just sit and let those emotions really descend upon us. And then the other thing is, the other way that we might deal with difficult emotions is we come out swinging. So things like agitation, yelling, aggressiveness, whether it's in our words or our body, whatever it might be, that might be a third way. So just thinking about that, right? What one of those sounds most like you? If you are in a parenting partnership, what one of those sounds most like your partner? And what might that be about? Compassion fatigue. My guess is this is very familiar with all of you. That ongoing snowballing process that occurs in a demanding relationship with a needy individual. You feel emotionally depleted. It leads to profound ways in which you view the world and loved ones, profound changes in the ways. When you are suffering from compassion fatigue, research has shown that you work harder and harder with diminished results, okay? So compassion fatigue, chipping away at your resilience because you're working harder, you're expending more energy with diminished results, whatever that energy might be going towards, okay? And burnout, closely tied with compassion fatigue, when there's disillusionment, cynicism, physical, mental, emotional exhaustion that occurs frequently among individuals who are responsible for the care of another individual. So the thing that I want to make sure you hear about, that compassion fatigue and working harder with diminished results, right? I always want folks to know that because it is backed by research. And also, if you're having a hard time buying into this idea of resilience, nervous system health, self-care in relation to those 2 things, I want you to hear that. Sometimes that's a point of where people can get a little more motivated, right? To at least give it some more thought. Caregiver burnout. It's also talked about as a contagious syndrome. I think I might have mentioned this before. To choose your support wisely, that we need to be able to be in communities where we are seen and heard, where our experience is acknowledged and recognized. Okay, so that's really important. And also, there also needs to be work to get unstuck, move out of that current state, whatever that might be, and move in more hopeful directions. So a lot of the parents that I've worked with have found communities maybe where it is parents of kids their kids share a similar diagnosis or that sort of thing. But it's all about how awful, terrible, hopeless everything is. That's the entire conversation all the time. And that is contagious. It will not leave you in a better spot. It will make you even more burnout. Okay. So I would just encourage you to take inventory, take stock of where you're getting your support, and be very, very choosy, right, with where you decide to get that support for that reason. So these are some of the characteristics, not all of them, but some of them, of compassion fatigue and burnout. I'm going to, while I get a drink of water here, just let you look through these. And I would encourage you again to just make note of which ones you might be experiencing now, or which ones you might have experienced in the past. And again, if you're in a parenting partnership, the same with your partner. Okay. All right. Any questions about compassion fatigue and burnout? My guess is you're familiar with the terms, probably familiar with what it feels like to be in those spots. Any questions I can answer?
Hold on. So I have a question then, Eileen. I mean, so much of this is overlapping with other mental health issues. Like, how often are you seeing professionals that are knowledgeable and experienced in working with parents who have these characteristics? Because sure, there's therapists and whatnot, but to find ones that are skilled with understanding. This whole time I've been saying children with disabilities, but now I'm going to start saying brain-based differences. I mean, how often do you see it? How truly important is that? Or would you consider most mental health providers competent in dealing with that, if you're calling it maybe chronic trauma? Or
Yeah, we're going to move into trauma next. And I think that's a key piece. So I don't see it enough. I mean, there's way more parents out there who need that level of support and understanding than providers, in my experience. And that's not going to surprise any of you, I'm sure, if you've tried to find your own support. I do believe that there are a lot of really skilled therapists who work with adults that have these issues. And if they can be open enough to understand that it's a result of your parenting experience, then that usually is enough. That's not that they don't need to have the lived experience or necessarily be an expert in that particular difference or disability for you to make progress. But I've had a lot of parents whose experiences have been discounted. And so if they come in and talk about the trauma they've experienced because their child has been so aggressive that they've been physically harmed, for example, then it moves to shame and blame about what is that parent doing to set boundaries and to get their child under control, which the therapist, I'm sure, is looking at as supportive. Like, let's talk about ways that you can get your child to not be, punching you. And that's not helpful to them, right? Because it's not coming from this lens, and it's not even why they're there. They want to get support for that experience that's happened. So, but hopefully you all have enough information now that you can ask questions that will clue you in to whether or not that therapist can help you in the way that you need, right? So trauma is something that gets talked a lot about in our society, and it's often used in incorrect ways. I think it's things that are characterized as traumatic really actually aren't from the definitional standpoint. But the parenting experience that most of the parents that I work with have lived in is truly traumatic. And when we start talking about it from that lens, it almost, for many of them, it opens up this permission, like, oh, wow, okay, if I truly have experienced trauma, then yeah, I guess I am worthy of getting support and help. This actually is something that goes way beyond a normal, typical parenting experience, and I need support. So trauma, the result of extraordinarily stressful events that shatter your sense of security, make you feel helpless, and make you feel vulnerable. There's lots of symptoms that can be experienced as a result of trauma. I've just listed a few here that rise to the top in terms of my experience with parents. We're going to talk about the hypervigilance in a moment. But then there's also this added layer compounding that trauma, which is the lack of sleep that all of you have talked about, the medical system and the trauma that's come from that, either not being believed, not being adequately treated, needing to go in for, well, we talked about it last week, like possibly unnecessary procedures, all of that kind of stuff. That is traumatic. School experiences, and then just the sense of isolation, right? That you can't take your child certain places, you can't hang out with friends or family in the way that you would like, that nobody understands your experience. That is traumatic, right? So they've done studies where they have looked at the cortisol levels. Again, cortisol, our body gets flooded with cortisol when that accelerator, that stress is so great, so constant, there's no break kind of coming in to step in. So the cortisol levels of soldiers who have been in combat compared to the cortisol levels of parents of kids with extraordinary needs. And guess what? They can't see the difference between them. Okay? So I want to make sure that you hear that, because when we think of a soldier who has been in combat, if we were to meet somebody like that, we would never say, like, God, you're going to be fine. Yeah, you'll get over it. Don't worry. Yeah, that must be hard, but you'll be fine. Right? That would be totally insensitive. It would not match the intensity of their experience. I don't think any of us would think that was appropriate. But how often are we told that by other people, or do we think that ourselves? Almost all the time, right? So again, looking at the research and looking at what is happening inside of our body is comparable to somebody who has experienced combat. Okay, so that's when I say, please get your support. It really is something that needs that level of support. So hypervigilance, I wanted to highlight this for all of you. It comes up with lots of parents that I work with for different reasons, but especially with the seizure aspect of your parenting experience. It's not a condition itself, but it's a way of behaving that can cause trauma. It's when you are constantly anticipating danger, so you can never relax. You're always waiting for that next shoe to drop, so to speak. It's a brain's way of protecting you from danger, right? That really adverse event that has happened so many times that you're anticipating it happening again. Being hypersensitive to the environment or the people around you. Sometimes you can tell yourself, like, it's okay. Like, calm down. I don't need to be worried about this, but you cannot relax. Again, your body's saying, nope, past has shown me I can't relax. I'm staying here in this hypervigilant state just in case, right? So being on guard in anticipation of something bad happening in the future. So if you are interested in pursuing therapy, and we talked about different therapists and kind of qualifications they might have, EMDR is a trauma-based therapy that is amazing. I'm not trained in it and I don't practice it. So it's something that I always refer out to for parents. But it is for people who have experienced trauma. And I have had many parents who have had such great results from it. You can look it up, the EMDR official training website. They have a directory of those who have been certified in it. You can do it over telehealth if you're in a place where they haven't quite opened up to be able to go in person. That is also an option to receive that therapy. Okay. All right. So we've talked about recognizing our emotions, the way that we might not recognize them, and now that can chip away at our resilience. We've talked about the trauma that's there, that experience. I want to talk now about grief and loss, because this, again, is what I have found to be a universal experience for parents of kids who have differences and special needs. Again, looking at Brene Brown's work in her book, Rising Strong, her book, Rising Strong, is about what happens when we are in that face down in the arena. That's how she describes it. Like we've just had, the fight of our life and it kicked our butt and we're face down in the arena with dirt smeared on our face. How do we rise strong? How do we get up from that again and remain resilient and go on? And so it's not specific to parents of kids with extraordinary needs, but it is so applicable. I recommend it to parents all the time. So if you haven't read that book and aren't familiar with her, I would encourage you to read it. One of the experiences that she talks about is grief and loss and what that can do to our resilience. It is part of the human experience, of course, but it's how we manage it, how we recognize it that makes the difference. So she talks about grief and loss being the loss of what could be. And I want you to think about this in relation to your relationship with your child and parenting them. The loss of what could be, longing, so yearning for understanding, yearning for meaning, or longing for what you now know will not be, and feeling lost. So this constant attempt to reorient yourself to your physical, emotional, and social worlds. So grief, she describes it as something that can wash over us like this big wave and pull us underwater before we even realize what happened. Things that we didn't even know mattered to us don't happen or are absent, and it makes us break down in tears, those kinds of things, okay? I'm sure you're familiar with the stages of grief. If you've heard them in the past, I want to make sure that we list them here so that you understand how they're used and how they might apply and help you make sense of your experience. So it is not a linear process like I've put here with the arrows. That's how it's always illustrated, but you can jump around, you can move around. Unfortunately, you may get stuck in one place for a very long time if it's not recognized. And I want to mention that because oftentimes when I see parents together, so people who are parenting together, when we start talking about the experience and the rub between them, I'm always thinking about how does the grief play into this, because it is so universal and so present. And oftentimes it is much easier for us to be pissed off and angry and irritable than it is for us to recognize deep sadness. And so if we have one person who is, say, in that depression stage of grief, and one person who has moved into acceptance and is saying, okay, this is who our child is, let's go, we're hopeful, that kind of thing, that could be seen as not being in alignment, when really they are both in these stages of grief, just at different places. And so at the very point where they need each other the most, where we most need connection from other people, we can see it in a way that causes disconnection, right? But if you can see like, oh, okay, we actually are in the same experience, this grief experience, just at different places, then sometimes that can bring people together and be more understanding and in alignment with each other, okay? So you can, of course, spend some time in acceptance and then move back to anger. Like that is the flow, right? That is the flow. And again, I don't know that the goal is to completely rid yourself of grief. I mean, that would be wonderful. I don't know that it's fully possible. That place of acceptance, spending more time there is obviously the goal. When you move back into anger or depression, something like that, the goal really is to recognize that that's what's happened and not to get stuck there, to allow yourself the full weight of that, acknowledge your experience, remember, not denying your emotion, but then say, okay, how can I gently and actively move out of this spot so I don't get stuck here? Disenfranchised grief. Again, there's lots of research on disenfranchised grief. One of the populations that is studied are parents of kids with extraordinary needs. It is this grief, it is this loss experience that is not socially sanctioned. It is not openly acknowledged. It is not recognized by others. It is not publicly mourned. So if you think about the grief that we may experience from somebody who has passed away, that is socially sanctioned. It is openly acknowledged. People might give us a call, send us a card, send flowers. It is recognized by others. There are rituals to be able to really publicly acknowledge and recognize the loss in the life of that person. And it is absolutely publicly mourned in most cases. When we have grief as a parent of a child with special needs, and we're constantly moving through those stages, maybe there's a developmental milestone that's not met, something happens where we're back in our grief and nobody recognizes it. It is not acknowledged. It is not made public. And we don't feel like we have the opportunity to do that. Like, how do you even begin to have that conversation with it? That is only going to compound that grief experience. Okay. So some of the ways that this can present, it's going to look really similar to the compassion fatigue and the burnout. But I want to make sure that I list those here too, just to kind of re-emphasize the symptoms that you may experience in yourself. But again, this whole piece here is about how do we remain resilient? And so much of it is recognizing our experience for what it is so that we can get support and become more resilient, right? Gently move out of that place that maybe we've been stuck. Okay, so let me just give you a second to look at that. All right. The last piece that I want to mention here, I know that we're spending a lot of time with grief, but it is, as I said, so present and universal for so many of the parents that I work with. And when I'm talking with parents about their experience, there's things that they feel shame about and guilty about that we can oftentimes connect to their grief experience. So things like, my sister was telling me about how her child was misbehaving. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, that's all you're dealing with, right? And feeling bad about that, right? That lower tolerance, less relatability to challenges of other parents, grappling with feelings of jealousy and not feeling good about that. Like, oh, that's such a yucky feeling. I'm not usually a jealous person, but having that bubble up for you. Working through the feeling that we're betraying our children by saying anything negative about our experience as their parent or anything related to the loss that we've experienced as their parent, just feeling like we don't have permission to do that. And when we have those thoughts in our head, feeling really, really guilty about that. What was full of expansive possibilities has now narrowed. And if you feel like that is narrowing more and more and more and more, thinking about how that might be associated with grief in the manifestations and the build of that grief, and having that idea that the future becomes unimaginable. Like, you can't even possibly imagine living this way for this many more years or however it might be. Okay. So if any of that resonates with you and sounds familiar to you, I want you to know that you're not alone, right? It's a really common, unfortunately, experience for a lot of the parents that I work with. And also oftentimes connecting to, like, what is that about? And getting underneath it, just like we do with our child's challenging behaviors. And again, slowly, gently moving out of that stuck place can lead to getting out of survival mode, right? More thriving. Okay, I'm going to stop here so that we can take a break. So get yourself some water, some food, whatever it might be. I promise you, when you come back, we are going to move out of all of the things that chip away at your resilience. We're going to move out of what can we do about it, okay? Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. So again, taking a moment to back up, because today we're talking about our experience, the parent experience. And the reason for that is because we need to be of stable and sound body, mind, and spirit to be able to parent our child in the way they require for the remainder of our lives. That nervous system stability impacts our ability to co-regulate with our child who has a very fragile nervous system, needing more co-regulation than a typical child, and understanding why that might be difficult for us, our deeply held beliefs and values, the way we were raised, all of that stuff entering into this parenting experience. So now that we've talked about what can chip away at our resilience and highlighting a few of those pieces that I see most often with parents, to again try to raise your awareness. Is this part of your experience? Is it something that deserves and needs more of your time and attention? Now I want to move into what can we do about it, right? How can we begin to build our resilience and our nervous system health and stability? One of the places that I always encourage parents to begin is with self-compassion. This is one of the best ways to build your resilience. So if a parent says, I don't even know where to start, I'm overwhelmed by the idea of starting, it's like, well, can we begin with self-compassion? Things like, instead of beating yourself up, that you're not good enough, that you're not doing this right, that you should be better, giving yourself some self-compassion in those moments can start to build your resilience. If your compassion does not involve yourself, it is incomplete. So compassion is to suffer with somebody. To have compassion for others, you have to notice that they are suffering. Then it's a feeling of being moved by others' suffering so that your heart responds to their pain. When this occurs, you feel warmth, caring, the desire to help the person who is suffering in some way, realizing that suffering, failure, and imperfection is a part of the shared human experience. So thinking about this in terms of self-compassion, noticing that you are suffering and that actually is a really normal human response to the situation that you are in. Feeling moved by that so that you feel warmth and caring for yourself. You want to help yourself. You want to provide yourself with that gentle caring and love so that you can help move yourself out of that, and recognizing that everything you're feeling is part of that human experience. So responding kindly towards yourself, honoring and accepting your humanness, giving yourself grace. You've heard me mention these things throughout our entire time together. There is a reason for that. Instead of ignoring and soldiering on, you stop, you acknowledge how difficult it is, and take steps to comfort yourself. I mentioned a little bit earlier that many parents have described feeling as though if they stop soldiering on, or whatever they might call it or describe it as, that they will, and they acknowledge just how difficult their experience is, they will get lost in it. And that is a true concern for some people, especially if you have a tendency to disassociate. And so I want to just acknowledge that if that is a fear of yours, I'm not saying to discount it. I'm saying that if you have somebody who can walk alongside you to help with this, that so that you feel anchored to them, you don't feel lost, that might be the way to help you move through this. Listening to your nervous system. So many of us walking around on this planet, not just parents, not just moms, are very disconnected from our bodies. And one of the pieces that has to be in place to start to build your nervous system stability is to become more connected with your body. There, again, could be reasons based on your history or whatever might happen where being in touch with your body in that way is very scary and difficult. That there are reasons that you have that formed that disassociation. So I won't go down all the reasons why that is, but just knowing that if that's difficult for you, There's very logical reasons why that is. And also, there are steps you can take to slowly ease back into your body. Okay. So recognizing differences in your heart rate, when you start to have a little perspiration or sweat, is there tightness seen in your chest or other places in your body? Strain in your neck or your face, other bodily sensations. That is your nervous system talking to you. And then listening to your mind and what thoughts you have on repeat as you go throughout your day. They may have been there for so long on repeat that you don't even notice that they are there. So again, raising your awareness and having a conscious awareness of what is going through your mind. What thoughts do you have on repeat? When do you start to experience those slight pangs of anger or agitation, feeling confined or restricted or smothered, claustrophobic, feeling on the verge of tears, feeling out of control? What's happening in those moments? And taking notice, right? Observation and reflection. And trying to do that in a neutral stance of it is not good or bad. Your body is responding in a way that it thinks it needs to respond to keep you safe. I wonder why that is. How has my body learned this pattern? And how can I start to give myself self-compassion and nurture my body in ways where I can break that pattern and not experience those, what can lead to stuck places, negative outcomes. There is a book called Burnout the Stress, or The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. It is written by sisters. They're twins, actually. The Nagoski, I think it is. Nagoski sisters. And they talk about stress being a cycle that we need to see through in order to be of sound body, mind, and spirit. That when we don't see that stress cycle all the way through, we get stuck, and it has real ramifications and impact on our nervous system. And so they talk about all emotions having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And oftentimes what happens is we go from the beginning to the middle and we stay there and we get stuck and we never get to the end of it to see it through. Okay. So again, no emotion is bad. It is part of our human experience, even ones that can have a negative connotation like anger. It is not bad. There's a reason behind that. There's a reason, justification to be angry. And letting yourself feel anger, again, especially for women, something that we are often told is not okay, right? Letting yourself recognize that you are anger, but working through that anger so that you don't stay stuck there, okay? So this is part of these pieces of building your resiliency and your nervous system health is about completing the stress cycle. So we've talked about beginning with self-compassion, really, really difficult for many of us. I've never met a parent that gives themselves enough self-compassion. And then there's other pieces here that can bring us through that cycle. So movement and physical activity. Oftentimes when we hear about movement, we think of exercise, which sounds punishing. That is not what we're talking about here. Some people do appreciate that. Like part of my resilience building is like hard, breathless exercise. I do a lot of running in the trails around here. I have a Peloton bike that I love. I lift heavy weights. Like that is what does that for me. That is why I do that, right? Not as punishment, because I know that it helps me complete those stress cycle and build my resiliency. For other people, it is slow, gentle movement. And that is equally good and wonderful if that is what your body needs for nourishment. So it could be a walk, it could be yoga, it could be dance. So really thinking about how to move your body in ways that feel nourishing to you. When we have stress that settles into our nervous system, it settles in and it stays there. And you have all of those physical ramifications that we've talked about that lets you know that. If we ignore that, it doesn't go away. It just continues to build. So the best way to work that out of our system is by moving our body. Okay. It's oftentimes too why an accommodation for our kids when they're struggling is movement first, talking second, right? Same idea. Breathing, totally underestimated. It's like, oh, take a few deep breaths. Yeah, that's going to help. There are some breathing techniques that are incredibly helpful for down regulating our nervous system. Lots of apps out there that you can get coaching, lots of them for free. So I would encourage you to explore that if it's something that you've not explored before, maybe even discounted. That actually, speaking of the apps, one of the things that I wanted to talk about with physical activity is physical activity can be, for example, laying in your bed in the darkness, listening to some soft music, and creating tension in your toes and your feet, holding it for a few seconds and releasing it. Then moving up your body with every muscle group that you can feel and activate, creating tension, letting go of that tension. Okay, that is physical activity, that is movement. If that is where you need to start, just begin, right? Positive social interactions. We are all wired for connection. It is a biological imperative. Many of us find ourselves in very isolated places. And so prioritizing connection, bringing to mind, who is it that gives me that co-regulation now that you have that lens to see it through, who helps me be more regulated? Bringing that person to mind, and then maybe even noting those people. Hopefully you all have one, if not two people, or more if you're really lucky. And what can I do to build connection with them on, say, a weekly basis? It may not be possible to see them. I understand that for all kinds of reasons. But there are other ways to build connection with them, right? And to have them be more present in our lives. So making that a priority. And again, being very choosy about who you choose to socialize with. Laughter, like that deep belly laugh, like what is it that brings that to your life? For many of us, it's been a very long time since we've had that kind of spontaneous, deep belly laughter. Is there a show? Is there a memory? Is there a person? Whatever it might be. Affection. This often gets missed, right? We all need physical touch. We all need that affection. Are we giving it? Are we getting it? How can we make that need known with the people that are around us and can provide that to us? Having a good cry. That is such a wonderful way to reset your nervous system. So many of us hold back tears and we stuff it down for whatever reason. We don't want to feel vulnerable in front of the people that we're in the presence of in that moment. Maybe we feel silly for crying, whatever it might be. I would encourage you to let it go. When you feel that urge to cry, to just let it go. It is so cleansing, and it is such a great way to reset your nervous system. So to think about it that way, like, ooh, that was a really great reset, rather than, oh, you shouldn't have cried, right? Why did you cry again? You shouldn't have that reaction, whatever it might be. And then creative expression. So I don't think of myself as a creative person as in terms of arts. If you are, wonderful, this will be much easier for you than it is for me, but there are other ways to be creative, right? So not limiting it to things like artwork or playing music or whatever it might be that we traditionally think, but what kind of other creative ways can you tap into that part of yourself? And then building resilience. These are some of the pieces that we just talked about on the other slide and I've been talking about throughout, but I want to make sure to highlight them. So providing yourself with grace and with self-compassion, right? That's where you need to begin. We talked about the breath, focusing on the big three, so we can get really wrapped up in kind of the health culture of what we should be doing, all of these shoulds. If we focus on movement in the way that I've described it, sleep, I know, which is especially challenging for all of you, but as much as you can, and fueling the body with food that is pleasurable and also healthy, right? You can have both, and also water, right? That is going to build your resilience in your nervous system. spending time coming up with coping skills that keep you grounded. We're going to talk about these things in a minute. So you guys think about what you might do, because I want to hear from folks on what you might take away and do. Mantras, visualizations of a person or place that makes you feel grounded, bringing them to mind in those challenging moments. Acknowledging your human experience and your human response, and gently work to move out of those feelings. And there is no timeline involved in this. There are days where we need to be able to settle into whatever our experiences of grief, of sadness, of anger, disappointment in someone. And we may need to hang out there for a few days, a week, whatever it might be. But understanding that you're intentionally hanging out there to help yourself, and that the plan is you're also looking forward to how am I going to come out of that, right? That you always have that kind of in mind too, that you want to gently support yourself in moving out of that. Finding spaces that provide you with empathy and connection, and then practicing gratitude. And the piece that I always add gratitude in there, because research shows us that we are more resilient people if we can have a regular practice of gratitude. And also in those moments where you don't feel like practicing gratitude, to give yourself grace and self-compassion, right? I have a lot of parents too that I should be more grateful. I should be more grateful, right? It's like, well, maybe that's not what space you're in right now. And maybe that is chipping away at your resilience, telling yourself you should, right? Instead, allowing yourself to feel however you are in that moment, right? Moving through it slowly. All right. I'm going to bring you all back here. So I intentionally left a lot of time so that we can talk about, I want to talk about the resilience piece and what we've talked about specifically today. So let's start there. But I also want to move back to all three sessions kind of as an overall overarching piece and talk about questions that you may have, remembering what we've kind of where we've been and building up to today, so that you can leave with the full kind of spectrum of understanding in your mind. Okay. So first, I'd love to hear about your reactions to today's focus on yourself. How are you feeling? What has it brought up for you? What do you think about when I say resilience building? What does that look like for you?
So I just have to laugh. On your screen, it says building resilience just begin. And to me, that's so I can start that on Monday, right? Because in my mind, it's always like, okay, I can do this, I can do this later. I can build up to that. And just forgetting that there's like little tiny pieces you can always start with. But that's like historically one of my behaviors of, all right, Monday, it's it. We're changing everything. We're going to do all of this in place. So being able to find those little things to put into place right now, literally. Yes. Sitting here right now with my coworker in the background too. So
yes. Yes, I love that. And I think too, that is part of our, equating resilience building with just this, again, popular culture idea of health and wellness. And I'm going to start X, Y, and Z practices on Monday, right? And so moving away and knowing that this is a completely different category of what we're talking about, that not only does our lives literally depend on us putting these into place, right? All of the health ramifications, all of the things that can happen as a result of us not doing this are very real and present, and that we don't have to do it all. It doesn't have to be this complete life transformation starting today. It can be just gently easing into moments at a time.
Eileen, I really appreciate this last session. I appreciate all the sessions. I'm so glad that you talked about grief, because I've always said there's always something new to grief. Just when you think you got it down, something will, and sometimes it's months, sometimes I can go years, and something will trigger and you're right back in the cycle. So that permission that we give ourselves to grieve, I really, really appreciate that. I do have a question too. Both my husband and I are really, really terrible at reading ourselves. and when we're stressed out or overloaded. A year ago, my doctor said, no, Mary Kay, it's not normal to be waking up in the middle of the night screaming. And I was like, really? Are you sure? Because that happens all the time. So I didn't think I was stressed out. She's like, something going on here. Is there something that we can say to ourselves, or something that we can say to another caregiver to sort of take us out of that stressful moment and start reflecting? Because I'm not really good at that.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like what you're describing is a trauma response. I mean, whatever it might be. I mean, that's when you hear stories of soldiers who have been in combat and their spouses talking about them waking up in the middle of the night, screaming and yelling, whatever it might be, whether it's from a conscious flashback or not. I mean, it's your body, right, responding to all of the stress that you've been under. So that I'm glad that somebody pointed that out to you. And also so many parents have such, to me, like such overt, clear signs of trauma like that. Like, of course, that's not normal, you know? But when you are buried under your lived experience, you don't recognize it, right? So the importance of really seeing it for what it is, and I'm so glad you had a provider who could help you do that. So to get to your question, what it sounds like you're asking, to me at least, is what are grounding exercises that we can't, if we're not grounded and in our bodies, then it's going to be really hard to reflect on what's happened, right? Because the grounding has to happen first. And so there are things that we can do, like mantras. Again, this is going to be specific to what works for you, but are there phrases or things that you can repeat to yourself that help you come back into your body? And it could be just that, like come back to myself, come back to my body, whatever it might be. Are there visualization exercises that you can do? So bringing a person to mind that helps you feel grounded, whatever that feeling of groundedness is. I'm going to assume you've experienced it at some point in your life. What person helps you get there? Or is there a picture of a place? Like every time you go to this place, like near the water or into the forest or a particular location that has really good associations, bringing that to mind. And maybe you have a physical picture of that person or that place to help you get there if bringing it to mind isn't possible because you are so disassociated, right? Those are a few that come to mind. I don't know if others have, if this grounding exercises piece that I'm talking about makes sense, if you have other ways that you do that. Does that help, Mary Kay, to get you started?
It definitely does, Eileen. And I think one of the things that is coming to mind for me is to almost have a code word or a code phrase when we're in the thick of it, you know, for each other to sort of, you know, bring up like, oh, wait, we're supposed to be mindful here. We're supposed to be thinking about what if we can't do this thing we're asking them to do. So I'm thinking we might come up with something, and hopefully something with humor.
Yes.
Hey, wait, think about this.
Yep. Yeah, I love it. I love it. Yeah, some things like, you know, what if, let's think, what if. I mean, that doesn't have to be it, but when parents hear these phrases over and over again, usually something sticks and they use that together. But I love the way that you're talking about working with your partner too on this. That can be a super delicate conversation for some couples because there is this history of tension and friction if you are in a parenting partnership. So to be able to kind of take a step back again, recognize each of your experiences for what it's been. Like, no wonder you've been such a jerk for so many months. Now I see that there is all this sadness, right? If you can have those types of conversations, I promise you it will be transformative. Doesn't happen overnight, right? It's maybe you need help, a facilitator to help you have them. But then to be able to be a reflection for each other, right? Like you said, sometimes people can see us getting dysregulated before we recognize it. Letting your partner know, I want you to be able to tell me when you see it. This is how it would be helpful for me, for you to tell me. It's not like, oh, you're losing it again, right?
Do not see the right thing in the moment.
Give them the language that you want to hear that will help you ground. right, will help you come back into your body.
I don't suggest calm down. That's
Yeah. I wouldn't either. I wouldn't either, right? But those are those visceral reactions taking over. If you have the conversation proactively, it's going to have a much better chance of going over well. Yeah. How about others? I'm interested to hear how you're feeling after this focus on you. Does it feel hopeful? Do you feel weighed down by it? When have you spent this much time? Is it a regular practice of yours to spend this much time thinking about yourself, or is it new?
It definitely depends on the time of year. When the kids are home for the summer, it's just all about the kids, can't do anything. So once they're in school and you have time to yourself, then you can put more effort into that.
Mm-hmm. And so, Amy, I'm curious about, in kind of hearing the way that we've talked about it today, do you see ways to have something that is constant in terms of resilience building and for yourself? And again, I'm talking about nervous system health and stability during those summer months, because that's not uncommon. It's like, I was so good for these months. And even that is judgmental of ourselves, right? I was so good. And then it fell off for all these months because life just got in the way. So do you see something that could be consistent, or are you still having a hard time kind of buying into that piece?
No, like my daughter's older. So if I need to like take time for myself, she's here and she can watch my son. So I can take a nap, or we have a town beach that's up the street from us. I go there and read if I have to.
Great. Awesome. So it sounds like you have things that you know you can bring to mind to do. It's just doing them.
Right.
Just easier said than done. Yeah. Yeah. I get that. How about others?
I think, I feel like a lot of the skills or coping techniques that, maybe have worked in the past are harder in the world of COVID. Going through this additional surge is causing a lot of additional stresses and removing a lot of potential avenues to relieve stress in terms of being able to get out or get together with other people or things like that. And I was hearing Amy talk about differences at different times of the school year. Brings up for me, my daughter has finished school this spring, so she no longer has school, and we have the additional COVID. I just had surgery, so I can't drive, I can't go anywhere, I can't do a lot of physical activities that would be a stress reliever for her and for me. And I think it's just a good reminder that what maybe worked in the past might not work now, and you have to keep being open to looking for other ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. Give Cindy a hug, Kathy. Virtual hug. Yeah. What you also bring up for me is making sure that our resilience building matches the intensity of our reality, which in and of itself is a challenge, right? Because you all are living some very, very intense realities. But having that in mind, that things that maybe worked before when we had some respite, whether it was school or otherwise, that we don't have now, or that other parents talk about their kind of release valves, that may work well for them, but when we're looking at our situation, it's a different ballgame. Yeah, it's really tough. The other thing that I think a lot about is, and I'll talk with parents about this, is I think that when we have lived in the realities that we live in, each of you has a different lived reality, myself included, but there's underlying themes, right? Underlying similarities. But it becomes our norm. And people understand that our experience might be more challenging than theirs as a parent, for example, but they don't know the day-to-day. And we've stopped talking about it long ago. We don't mention it much, right? And so as the years go on, people may forget or not understand just how challenging it continues to be. And so I've asked parents before, who is that person that you have thought about asking for more support and more help, like really letting them into your world in that way, being really vulnerable and letting them know just how hard things are? Who is that person that you thought about doing that with, that you haven't done that with? Because many people want to help, they just have no idea how to do it, right? So if you are lucky enough to have those people in your lives, I know it takes some vulnerability, but asking for that and being very specific on what you need from them, right? So people who do things, you put them into action, they function really well that way. People who just are like a good time, you know that they're not going to go deep with you, but they'll make you laugh. And then people who you really feel seen and heard, right? If you're lucky enough to have friends in all those categories, use them with their strengths in mind. Yeah. How about others? Anyone feeling slightly agitated after this session? I often hear that from parents too. It's kind of stirred up some things that they're not quite sure how to settle back.
I wouldn't say I feel agitated, but I would say that it's harder to focus on this last session. But that's kind of my whole life. Like if I read a book that has to do with my son, I'll read the whole book. If I try to read a book that, for pleasure, that I actually enjoy, it takes me 6 months where I can read a book about, something to help him in a day. So it's kind of the same thing. And I keep, telling myself, okay, refocus, bring it back. This is important too. But, I'm not agitated at all. I'm just kind of like, oh, this part's not as important.
Yeah. I appreciate your honesty. You're not the only one thinking it, I'm sure.
I know that it is. Yeah. But there is that part of your brain that's like, yeah, it is, but is it really so that's an interesting share that I thought I would give because it's consistent throughout my life.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you recognize the pattern there, right? With those patterns comes a lot of information for us in terms of what that's about. But you are not alone in that. And, the reason why I make sure to cite what comes from research is so that you're continuously reminded that there is hard science behind this. And that it is not optional for us. Our lives literally depend on it. Okay? And if it's not urgent now, it will become urgent if we don't focus on it. And all of if you felt hope and promise and energy from the first 2 sessions about your child, amazing, wonderful, hang on to that. And also you will reach a stopping point in terms of your progress to be able to implement it if you don't start to also recognize your experience and give yourself the attention that you need and deserve, right? And again, doesn't have to be in these huge, monumental ways. Most of us don't have the capacity for that in our lives, but just begin with small acknowledgements of your experience and what you can do about it. Yeah, I appreciate that reflection.
I'm glad you said that. Sorry, Hillary. I'm glad you said that, Bonnie, because I've found myself keep constantly thinking of other things during this one. I'm like, why can't I focus on this session? And I'm also just constantly tearing up this whole session.
Yeah. So the other piece the other piece that I would encourage you all to be curious about, if that's been your experience, and thanks for sharing that, Amy, is what is that about? You know, is it about that going there is just too much? It's just too much. You feel yourself getting disassociated or dysregulated by even hearing the topics that might resonate with your lived experience. And that if that's the case, then I hope you take that as a really, really big, flashy sign that says, I need to get some support. I deserve more support. Right? So I'm sending you a big hug too, Amy. Hillary, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think I'm a pretty good case study in proving what you just said about, I forgot now what the exact words you said, but just that if you don't do something about, if you don't get the support, like you're going to run out. And sometimes you can know everything that you should do, everything that you need, all the ways that you need support. And you can try to do all the parts that you can do yourself, and keep asking, you know, and not be able to engage it. And the stuff you're trying to avoid, the result of what happens when you burn out happens anyway. Some people are entirely alone. There is no co-parent. There is no friend that is a good co-regulator. There is no friend that's a shitty sorry, I just cursed. It's a crappy co-regulator. There is no one. Maybe the people in your life are doing the same exact thing you are. Maybe they're on the same video call right now. And so they can't, how do you two drowning people keep each other from drowning? And actually the people that aren't drowning think that's a thing. I mean, so I just want to thank you, because I've been looking for years for a clinician that understands what I'm talking about and what I need, and who will give me the validation to liberate me from some of these absurd beliefs that I was infused with from birth and have been reinforced by my family and by society, and that I don't have another script to replace it. And I am trying to do all of that work while I'm still over here trying to do this impossible parenting job, and also trying to get an education so that I can afford to even feed and house this child. Like it's a lot. And I just want to say thank you. And I also want to be a cautionary tale for my friends who are on a similar path to do these things now. It's the same idea as when you have an infant and you take the infant home and everybody tells you, look, honey, just sleep when the baby sleeps. Just don't try to go back to your normal life. You don't have that anymore. So for the next 4 to 6 months, you just go to sleep. It doesn't matter what time it is. You go to sleep when the baby goes to sleep, right? And you learn, oh, yep, they're right. I need to do that. It's like that concept. You may not even feel entirely drained or burned out, but please start implementing these things anywhere you can, because you could find yourself in a position where you can't even do it when they need to. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for sharing that. I think too, what your comments bring to mind is, well, first I want to say that you're so generous in sharing your experience and what you call a cautionary tale. And I also have an immense amount of hope for you, even where you are, okay, where you've described being. Parents don't come to work with me when they're doing well. That would be like the ultimate proactive thing, right? But it just doesn't happen that way. And I've seen a lot of parents in really, really, really dark places where they've been for a very, very long time and been able to come out of that. And again, I would never say that it happens overnight or that it's always easy, but it is worth it. But it takes that consistency and having others hold the belief for you, and allowing yourself, even if you don't believe, like, oh, I don't know if that's going to make a difference. My situation is so hard, so bad. I understand that intimately. And maybe if you just allow yourself to believe me or others in your life who say the same things for a moment and just begin, maybe you'll start to slowly see a different reality.
For me, it feels like even if we do all of these things, it's not going to make the impact that we wish it would, because we still have to live this reality. And I think that doing these things really only allow us just to function as we need to function in our reality, but that it's never really going to make us feel comfortable or relieved or anything like that. It's just going to allow us to function.
Mm. Yeah, maybe that's enough right now to have that belief, right? That is a really good opportunity for me to link the 3 sessions together, because I want to make sure that's clear. And we're not moving from this topic. I want to hear from others if you want to share. But the reason why we start with our child is because people are more engaged. And that's what they've really come for, right? And talking about this different parenting paradigm, this different lens, which to view them through. And from the very beginning, you might remember in the very first session, I talked about how it's an individualized approach. So while the foundation is the same, because your child is their unique self, the accommodations, their lagging skills are going to look different, right? And that it's a steep learning curve. It doesn't happen overnight. So somebody has to be able to hold some belief that things can get better, whether that's you and you can keep that for yourself, or you have a group of people who can remind you of that, right? That is one of the biggest benefits of the community that I run, is that there are so many parents in there that parents will post like, I am in a really, really bad spot, or on our live Zoom calls, I'm in this awful spot. They describe it. It is awful. And there's a parent on there who can say, I know where you've been. And we were there 4 years ago. And this is what it's looked like since then, right? And they described the 4 years since then. It wasn't like we were there 4 years ago and 4 years in one day, this magical thing happened, right? And there is a reason why that parent who's in such a better spot is in that community, because they still need the support. Things didn't magically disappear for them either, right? But they can hold that hope. So understanding that that is part of the process, but that energy, it's not working harder. It's putting that energy that you're already expending in trying to exert power and control, becoming frustrated, burnout, disillusioned, whatever it might be, putting it in a different place, right? To slowly over time get to a better spot. But in order to do all of that work that we talked about in the first 2 sessions, we have to focus inward too. That is like the key piece to be able to move in the way that we've, described in those first 2 sessions. So there are absolutely days in my own parenting experience where I would say, like, man, this is hard. Today was hard, and it's always going to be this hard, right? Those days are much less, and I can get out of those stuck spots. I wouldn't even call them stuck spots at this point, much more easily, right? Because of living from this lens more consistently over the years, right? You don't get there overnight. So it's not denying your experience by any means.
I think personally from our experience that on a daily basis, we like cycle through those phases of grief, but we're constantly redirecting back to the acceptance part of it, which kind of makes that, the day run a little more smoothly because we're able to focus on that acceptance piece of it, more commonly than we are the other parts of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. The other thing, April, that I would just, and this may or may not be your experience, but for others kind of thinking about that is, not feeling like acceptance is a place you have to rush to. Like, that is how I perfect this. This is how I say that I'm a good parent. If I was a good person, that is where I would be. And so always rushing yourself through the grief that maybe comes before it. But yeah, that acceptance piece is huge. And I like how you describe coming back to it, right? It's not like you reach it and then you stay there. You have to come back to it.
Can I just say that the one of the things I think your approach, one of the things it does, or that I can see that it's going to help me do, is like if you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And sometimes when the kids are in crisis, and it varies, but sometimes you're at the bottom. Maslow's hierarchy, for anybody who doesn't know, that it's like a pyramid of your basic needs in life, and you have to have, like food, air, shelter, like it builds on it. So and it says like you can't have, the higher levels are like fulfillment and achievement and content, peace basically. And it says if your needs aren't met down here, you can't get up there. And to me, Eileen, this is like, I worked really hard and I managed to get myself up pretty at a good spot, and I felt good about it. And then things happen and they kind of knock you back down. And then COVID, like if you weren't knocked down before, I mean, COVID kind of was like the Control-Alt-Delete for everybody, right? And to me, like you said, this is very hopeful. This is very hopeful because I just need help. And the regulation and co-regulation, it to me is part of what's down here at the bottom. I keep gesturing to an imaginary pyramid. You all get it. But the co-regulation to me is down at this bottom layer of my needs, of my basic needs. And I live in such a life where you get trapped in that fight or flight, and you're functioning, you're just more and more compromised. It's just the snowball effect, right? And so this system to me is going to be very helpful for the times where I'm knocked back down, and how to help get back to where I can start having fulfillment and different types of self-care woven in, because that is so important for the hopelessness and despair feeling. If like Nicole said, we can do all these things, but we still have basically this stuff that we are sad about, that we have to deal with, right? And that's true. And I was just thinking about, why has my despair gone so high? And it is because the things that I had been able to be doing, that when I looked in the mirror, I was like, I'm doing okay at life. I'm managing my parenting, which is very hard. And I'm also going to school and learning things and continuing to grow as a person. And I'm having other things that I'm, working toward. Those things work together to help me regulate myself better.
Yeah. Yep. It really is a cycle and a domino effect. And if you think about, in the first session, some of you may remember the pyramid that I showed about this model. And at the bottom is the primary characteristics, secondary characteristics, accommodation, so on and so forth. I've often thought about the parent experience should actually be the bottom piece under primary characteristics. I believe it is. It's not the order I go in terms of teaching it. And again, just knowing what usually motivates parents to come to these trainings is to learn about their child, right? And I understand that intimately. And we obviously do a lot of that. But I often think about that parent experience and everything we've talked about today actually being the foundation. All right. I want to take a little bit of a step back from today's content and think about all of our time together. This is an opportunity for you to ask any questions you have about all that you've learned. Are there points of confusion that you want to help have sorted out? Are there points of tension where you feel like, I'm still not sure about that. I'm not sure I buy into it. I'm not sure I understand it. Anything at all that you want to talk about before we wrap up and say goodbye?
I'm curious for input from you or anyone else in the group on, as you talk about changing expectations, or, could be looked at as letting it go, or things like that. And I struggle with that a lot with Clarissa, primarily from the standpoint, our biggest behavioral issues and our biggest battles come from what I feel is a disconnect between what she tells me she wants for her future life, what she, thinks she should be able to accomplish and do. She's 19, so she has a vision of what she wants to be like as an adult. And in some cases, some of what she talks about is potentially within reach with a lot of effort. But anytime I try to push her to do any of those things that would potentially lead toward what she states are her goals, she completely shuts down. For instance, she would like to live in at least a semi-independent setting, whether that's, a guest house behind our house, or a house next door, or, an apartment adjacent to where we're living, or what that would look like. But she always says she wants to live by herself or with her boyfriend. But when you ask her to do even the most basic chores, do the most basic self-care, she refuses. And even when you point out, well, if you are going to live by yourself, you need to learn how to do these things, she flat out refuses. So I'm caught between feeling like, as her parent, if I want to help her reach her goals, I need to push her to do these things, versus acknowledging some of these things are difficult for very real reasons, pain, ability, whatever. And do I want to fight that battle? And I'm just curious of input for managing that tension between, do I fight this battle now, when no matter how many times I try to explain to her in how many different ways you have to do X, Y, and Z to do what you tell me you want to do, she disagrees, or she doesn't see the connection. She thinks she should be able to live with her boyfriend, and I guess he will do everything. And she'll sit there eating bonbons all day, living with her boyfriend. I don't know.
Yeah. What do others think?
I'm just curious, how do you balance that tension? Because it's our everyday.
Yeah.
So I have an older child as well, and we recently did, it's called an ESTR assessment, and I can put it in the chat. Enderle-Severson Transition Rating Scale. Basically, what are the elements that your child would need in order to do various different things? And it was really eye-opening for me, because things that I never thought about. What are the, and Eileen talked about this in the first and second session, what are the little steps that lead to X, Y, and Z, and our understanding of whether our kids can actually get there or not. So Kathy, I wonder if there's not if Clarissa cannot join together this thing with something I want in the future. But instead of like a big thing, like you're going to do this in order to be able to move out, it's, can you put the silverware in the right place in the drawer? Do you know what to do in case of an emergency? How to operate a microwave, that sort of thing was really, it was eye-opening for me because it broke everything down. And that's, I don't know, I can, if you haven't taken that, I'll put it in the chat, and that might be able to help with some little steps instead of big steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in our case, it's some of it is my uncertainty of what level of independence is potentially achievable. But there's also, I think, a very real disconnect between her ability or willingness to recognize that what she does today impacts where she can potentially be. And it seems that it's something that developmentally we're seeing more and more. She, like I said, she recently graduated high school. One of her favorite activities in high school was chorus. That's something she really misses. She's talking about wanting to join chorus, but she decided she only wants to join a chorus that pays the singers. So it's almost like she comes up with ideas where what she says she wants by design are unachievable. Yes. In some cases, and in other cases, it's either an unwillingness or inability to kind of self-reflect. She takes part in Special Olympics gymnastics. She's decided that she wants to be in the regular Olympics. She wants, or at least Special Olympics on TV, the World Special Olympics, and doesn't acknowledge or recognize differences in what she is doing and the level of effort she is willing and able to put into it versus the athletes who are doing some of those things. And if you try to point it out, even as gently as you can, she puts up a wall right away and that disconnect between what she states her goals are versus what she's willing to do to get them is getting bigger the older she gets.
Yeah. It's interesting how you describe even the Special Olympics gymnastics idea, and like, what age does that remind you of? Like a very young child, like dreaming big. I love her ambition, right? Not having any sense of what it takes, right?
I don't want to hamper her dreaming.
Mm-hmm.
But she's after me all day long, every day, that I'm going to go to nationals, and she's pushing herself. She recently injured her foot. She didn't want to stop practice for gymnastics for the foot to heal because then she couldn't go to nationals in her mind. But of course, there are so many other issues at play that have nothing to do with her foot, and trying to balance the dreamer versus the reality.
Right. And not have tension exist between the two. I mean, you mentioned the tension there, and I'd be curious about what deeply held beliefs and values are that tied to, that you feel like you must push, or however you want to describe it, that there must be some tension there. Like, she says she wants to do this. Well, she must do this and this and this. Or can she dream and you can support her dream? Oh, that's great. Oh my gosh, that would be so wonderful, wouldn't it? And also then come back to where she is really in reality and what lagging skills are there, and support her with accommodations there, to not necessarily be like, well, if you're going to do that, you have to do this, you have to do that, when there is such a wide gap between those two places for her, right? But the skills that you mentioned, I mean, you are on that track of what skills are involved in that. Why can't she do it? Future thinking, being able to anticipate or even picture the future. Like that idea of, I guess she just thinks her boyfriend will do it all for her. My guess is she probably can't even envision what it looks like to know whether she thinks that or not, right? But those A plus B equals C, like even the very obvious connections are just not there. So I know that the relentlessness, it sounds like, which she pursues these dreams is exhausting. But I wonder if beginning with how can I not have this be such tension within me will then allow you to then kind of then, have more resiliency to deal with the relentlessness and that balance of those two things.
Eileen, can you talk a little bit about, first of all, I was really heartened to hear you say that self-regulation can come. That's huge. Would we expect the level of self-regulation to match the level of their other skills and cognitive ability? Or could it? Okay.
Yeah, just like when we talked about dysmaturity, and you might remember the uneven development, looking at different skills and how it might be different ages or, stages, whatever you want to describe it as. For those different skills, self-regulation is the same thing. So a really good example may not apply to your kids, but with other kids who have some sort of brain-based difference and they look very neurotypical, and this is their largest area of struggle, this executive functioning skill. And so they are always the child that's like melting down, lashing out, causing the disruption, like in the school setting, for example. But in all these other skills, they may be very typical, right? So yeah, no, it can be different, just to add to the complexity a little.
That's good. That makes me happy. I also wanted, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, but looking at that dysregulation or the lack of self-regulation and saying, what age does this remind me of, right? And what would I do with a child of this age to help soothe them, help calm them, help provide co-regulation, right? Is another good perspective. Go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that totally unrelated, saw a Facebook post from a friend today who has school-age kids talking about don't do things this weekend, the first week after school. We haven't started back to school, but I know a lot of people have. And basically going through everything that you've been talking about for the last 3 weeks to say, they're exhausted, they're overloaded. You might want to go out for a celebratory dinner. Don't do it. Order pizza, dark room, relax. And I was it just came back to like, this is exactly what you've been talking about, the kind of overload that most of us in our lives didn't see.
Right. Yeah, it really points back to this being about the human experience more than our kids, right? It's just more exaggerated, more intense, more profound with our kids because of their differences. But even, I mean, back to school is like a huge piece to remember that cognitive load, but even very regular activity. So during the time that we've been talking, my daughter went to martial arts, which she loves, she looks forward to. It's a great environment for her. And the rest of the day, we don't plan anything for her. Even though she loves it, it's a life-giving thing for her. She is tired, not just in her body, but in her mind from all of the skills, the listening, the body coordination, all of that kind of stuff, right? So it could be something pretty small like that they need to recover from for much longer period of time than we would ever guess. Yep. And when in doubt, provide the buffer of time, just in case, right? All right, you guys. So I'll mention a few ways to find more resources and to get more support if that's something you're interested in. So on my website are lots of blog posts that dive deep into many of the topics that we've talked about today. Those, of course, are always there for you. You can also find on my website a link to kind of a directory of resources and podcasts that I've been on and that sort of thing, if that's helpful to you. The Brain First Parenting program, I've mentioned before that you should not register for that unless you want an in-person refresher of all of the material we've gone over today. So I just want to make sure that's really clear. That would not be different than what you've experienced. The Resilience Room is the membership community that I mentioned. It has, I think we're over 200 parents now. There's a private Facebook group. There's a course room that has mini lessons. I think there's probably over 40 in there. If you were to join you would dive right into those lessons, have those accessible to you. We have webinars some months that focus in on particular topics, like September we'll focus on schools, recorded coffee chats with other members where you get to listen in on my conversation with them, going through a particularly challenging event or situation and hearing me coach them through it from this brain-based perspective. A lot of parents really enjoy listening to those. And then live group meetups every month. So it was created because when I started on this path and was super excited about it and wanted to deepen my understanding, I could not find a place to do that. It's like, where are my people? That training was great and now we're done and it's still hard. Help, right? So it's helping us stay on that path more consistently. And you can find out information about the Resilience Room on my website. There is an open and closed enrollment. And so I want to say this, especially for the folks listening to this after the fact. If you go to my website and it says that it's closed for enrollment, please just email me individually. And so I can let you join that way. Let me know that you know, why you're contacting me, how you heard about this information, and you can join even if it's a closed enrollment period. Okay. I think that is about it. Marianne, anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just really wanted to say thank you, Eileen. We appreciate this opportunity to have this recorded, this entire workshop recorded for our community, and so that they'll have the ability to watch it as they're able to with their busy lives. And also just a special thank you to all of our parent participants. I just appreciate you being so open and vulnerable and really trying to reach the other members of our community through your experiences. So thank you.
I would echo that thanks and that gratitude. You all have been wonderful. It's been wonderful to spend this time with you. So as I said before, if you have questions that come up afterwards, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have an email dialogue with you. And Marianne, thank you for asking me. Really appreciate the opportunity to do this for folks. So, all right, everyone.
I just want to say thank you, Marianne, for putting this all together. I'm seeing some faces that I met at the Colorado conference, and it's really neat to see people again. So I hope we can have those in-person meetups again soon.
Me too.
Thank you, Marianne and Eileen. This was wonderful.
Welcome. All right, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend and hope our paths cross again. This isn't goodbye, it's just till later. All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.